that's actually incorrect. Egypt was not the first civilization in Africa. The first recognized civilization in Africa was a Nubian one that the Egyptians called Ta-Seti. And the Egyptians called it Ta-Seti not in relation to some description of the people or the land or even the animals. They called it Ta-Seti because of its military prowess. Ta-Seti means land of the bow, because the Egyptians knew that these Nubians were excellent archers, and from their perspective, these Nubians were the best in the world. So right off the bat, the Nubians were recognized for their particular militaristic character. So let's talk about the first foe that these Proto-Kushites had. We all know that Egypt conquered Nubian regions on different occasions. And you have every right to be like, well, home team, if you think Egypt's military was weak, how can you say that the Kushites were the most powerful military in African history if the Egyptians defeated them? The answer to that is twofold. Number one, that region that we would later associate as Kush was not unified like Egypt was. Because Egypt had more political and economic structure, many Nubians would go to Egypt for work, especially for the Egyptian military. And that leads us to our second point. Egyptians employed Nubians all the time in their military. Even King Xerxes of Persia employed Nubian archers. Weni the Elder, who was a court official in Egypt, mentioned how Egyptians employed Nubian soldiers all the time.
We can't deal with an economic crisis until you beat the pandemic. You can't have an economic comeback when almost 1,000 Americans die each day from COVID. Mr. President, do your job.
When His Majesty took action against the Asiatic sand dwellers, His Majesty made an army of many 10 of thousands from all of Upper Egypt, from Lower Egypt, and from Ejert Nubians, Medja Nubians, Yam Nubians, Wawat Nubians, Kau Nubians, and from Jeme land. Notice the diversity of the Nubians and how there wasn't necessarily any unified Nubian identity that would later become Kush. When you have Nubians that are employed by you, who have extensive knowledge of Nubia, its people, and perhaps its military capability, it becomes way easier to conquer the region. So Egypt had a tremendous advantage from the start. But the Egyptians began to notice something. The region started to become more unified, and this is where we suddenly see the Egyptians refer to the region as something totally different. Kush, or as they would say in their propaganda, vile Kush. We had a new identity forming in the region called the Kushites, and that's when the greatest military in African history was formed. After Kush gained its independence from Egypt, Egypt was never able to bang with the Kushites again. In fact, the bitter rivalry between Kush and Egypt ended when Kush conquered Egypt. The fact that Kush conquered Egypt, however, is not really the story like most would think. It's the relative ease in which Kush ran through Egypt. You see, nobody really mentions the time before Kush conquered Egypt, when the Kushites ran through Egypt, but simply decided not to stay and occupy it. Truly a sign of domination. It was a time that literally scared the crap out of Egypt. And as some scholars say, the Egyptians airbrushed this right out of the history books. After the region of Nubia reinvented itself and became Kush, it was pretty much a wrap, and the 25th dynasty of Egypt was created. The first non-African nation the Kushites encountered were the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians at the time were running through everybody. They were the ones who kicked the Kushites out of Egypt. This one is strange because even though the Assyrians were successful in the seesaw battle of power and influence, they never sought to go further south and attempt to conquer Kush. Perhaps that was their policy at the time. You would think after a long battle with Kush, you would want to ensure the southern neighbor of Egypt would no longer compete with you. But anyway, for whatever reason, the Assyrians did not go further south. And when we speak on other nations who did, we quickly understand why. Even though Kush lost Egypt, they maintained their independence in their homeland, which of course is ultimately more important. Let's do a brief summary. So first we have an independent Kush that body-bagged Egypt, ending the rivalry in a sort of inconclusive stalemate with Assyria as Kush maintains its independence. And now, with our next nation, we'll understand a little more why Assyria didn't go further south, because Kush records its first international body bag, Persia. Yes, most people don't know that Kush absolutely body bagged Persia in the most humiliating fashion. This is probably why King Xerxes decided to employ Nubian soldiers, because in all likelihood, he knew about Kush and how they gave them the complete business centuries earlier. Anyway, the story goes like this. The Persians under Cambyses II conquered Egypt at the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC. Funny story, actually. Persian soldiers used cats as shields because they knew the religion of Egypt forbade harm towards cats. Unfortunately for Egypt, this event marked the effective end of the history of ancient Egypt as the home of an autonomous civilization. Basically, after Persia, Egypt was never the same, and no Egyptian ruled Egypt autonomously. So of course, because Persia, like nearly every other nation, conquered Egypt so easily, they thought Kush would be the same. Boy, were they wrong. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian, Cambyses wanted to conquer Kush, so he sent spies to the pharaoh of Kush disguised as messengers bearing gifts. It was obvious to the Kushite king Amani that the Persians were spies. Really don't know how he thought that was going to work. Anyway, according to Herodotus, King Amani of Kush mocked Cambyses' gifts in front of the messengers and sent them back with a bow. The messengers were instructed to deliver the following message to Cambyses. When the Persians draw their bows as easily as I do, then he should march against the long-lived Kushites. So of course Cambyses was infuriated and in response led a huge army to Kush, thinking he was about to just run through the Kushites as he did the Egyptians. Cambyses moved his army south, and that's when we get to the body bags. Logistically, difficulties crossing the desert was just hell for the Persians, and they were compounded by the fierce response of the Kushite army, particularly accurate volleys of archery that not only decimated Persian ranks, but targeted the eyes of individual Persian warriors. One historical source notes, so from the battlements, as though on the walls of a citadel, the archers kept up with a continual discharge of well-aimed shafts, so dense that the Persians had the sensation of a cloud descending upon them, especially when the Ethiopians made their enemies' eyes the targets. So unerring was their aim that those who they pierced with their shafts rushed about wildly in the throngs with the arrows projecting from their eyes like double flutes. Honestly, what more is there to say? Kush by this time was world-renowned. Even when other nations dreamed of taking Kush, they dreamed of taking an L. For example, the Greeks. The Greeks had a very strange tendency to romanticize the Kushites. By this time especially, they've heard so much about them. After many Greek historians and scholars went to Egypt to study, they inevitably heard about the Kandaki warrior queens of Kush. The Greeks respected the military bravery and prowess of the Kushites, so much so that they wrote a romance referring to their military might. The story is mentioned as part of the Alexander romance. The legend goes like this. When Alexander attempted to conquer Nubia in 332 BC, the Kandaki warrior queen of Kush arranged her armies strategically to meet him and was present on a war elephant when he approached. Having assessed the strength of her armies, Alexander decided to withdraw from Nubia, heading to Egypt instead. Though romanticized a bit, non-African nations immortalized Kush and its military strength, apparently not even dreaming of going through the heartache of attempting to conquer it. Now let's discuss probably one of the most popular encounters between Kush and Rome. How Kush managed to steer through this conflict unscathed is nothing short of exceptional. It's a very important African story, and above all else, displays the power of Africa's greatest military. So essentially Rome, because they had conquered Egypt, they wanted to tax Nubians living in the area. The Kushites, of course, were vehemently opposed to this idea, and this is where the conflict began. The Kushites penetrated as far south as the Aswan area, defeating 3 Roman cohorts, conquering Syene, Elephantine, and Philae, capturing thousands of Egyptians and even some Roman soldiers, and overthrowing a bronze statue of Augustus recently erected there. The head of one of these Augustan statues was carried off to Meroe, the capital of Kush, as a trophy and buried under a temple threshold of Queen Amanirenas. Rome, of course, retaliated, taking the Kushite city of Napata, but they pulled back largely due to geographical conditions. The taking of Kushite territory did not deter Kushite resilience. 3 years later, under Queen Amanirenas, with strong reinforcements of African troops from further south, Kushite pressure advanced on the Romans. The Romans sent troops to meet the Kushites, but a final clash did not occur, but negotiations instead. Negotiations that favored the Kushites, giving them all they desired, including removing taxing policy of Nubians. The Meroitic diplomats were invited to confer with the Roman Emperor Augustus himself on the Greek island of Samos, where he was headquartered temporarily. The Kushites did not appear as beaten foes because of the aggressive message brought to the Romans by the envoys of Meroe. A bundle of golden arrows was presented with the envoys reportedly saying, "The queen sends you these arrows. If you want peace, they are a token of her friendship in war. If you want war, you're going to need them." Rome was no doubt one of the most powerful nations in the world at that time, and their strategic withdrawal from Kush can be seen as nothing short of respect for an underestimated enemy. No matter how we cut it, slice it, or dice it, the Romans didn't even want smoke with the Kushites. In conclusion, the Kushites kept their independence once again, and some may even say gained superpower status at this time. An organized ancient Kush was finally overrun by another African nation in the Aksumite Empire. Even when Kush finally ended, what resulted from it was 3 powerful Christian nations that we collectively call Christian Nubia. It was as though the region reinvented itself and invoked its superior military culture. For almost 600 years, the powerful bowmen of the region created a barrier for Muslim expansion into the northeast of the African continent, fighting off multiple invasions and assaults with stinging swarms of arrows. One modern historian likens Nubian resistance to that of a dam, holding back the Muslim tide for several centuries. The absolutely unambiguous evidence and unanimous agreement of the early Muslim sources is that the Arabs' abrupt stop was caused solely and exclusively by the superb military resistance of Christian Nubia. The Arabs were spreading Islam rapidly and conquering as far as North Africa and Europe, but the one region they simply could not conquer was the old region of Kush, or known then as Christian Nubia. The military history of ancient Kush is legendary and is the greatest in all of Africa. It deserves to be respected and glorified. Kush took on the most powerful nations on the planet and maintained a very impressive resume. They either completely bodied their enemies or non-African nations decided they didn't want no smoke via bipartisan agreement. Either way you look at it, ancient Kush is the golden child of African military genius. So I'm pretty much all out, guys. If you want access to sources and full African history courses, you can visit